My name is Patrick Donnelly, and I'm on a mission to build better leaders. For this episode, I had the amazing opportunity to talk with retired General J. Raymond. While we all make history in our own way, General Raymond will go down in the history books. And I mean the literal history books. He was the first chief of space operations for the U.S. Space Force. In that role, he, along with a capable team, shepherded the new service into existence, the first new U.S. military branch in 73 years. Our conversation was enlightening on many levels, but I particularly enjoyed hearing about how his non-traditional assignments and opportunities opened doors he never could have imagined. Believing in the value of creating a unique team identity myself, I found his discussion about the process of creating a new Space Force identity exceptionally interesting. Enough for me. Let's blast off with Guardian 1 and the USS F Enterprise. General Raymond, thanks so much for joining me today on Building Better Leaders.
Oh, thank you very much, Ben. I really appreciate it. I look back at our time very fondly, and I'm very happy that you're focusing on leadership because I don't think there's a better person to do it.
It's very kind of you, sir. I got to say, I've always said that I believe that each of us as individuals make our own mark on history. And in some ways, everybody's mark is important, but it's pretty overwhelming to think that I'm actually sitting here talking with a guy who's made history in the sense that your name's actually going to be in the history books forever as the first chief of space ops and the first, the person who really helped usher in the birth of the United States Space Force as a separate service. Did you ever imagine as that ROTC senior or the butter bar second lieutenant coming out of Clemson that, man, one day I'm going to stand up the first new military service in 73 years?
That almost makes me laugh. Absolutely not. In fact, when I was a junior in college at Clemson University, General Hardinger, who was the first commander of Air Force Space Command that stood up back in 1982, came and spoke at an AFA event in Clemson. And I remember going to that and seeing this guy talk about space and what the Air Force was doing in it and why this command was so important. And I remember just being in awe of this guy, and there's no flipping way I could ever do that. Years later, in 2016, I took command of that same organization, and I remember thinking at that time, although it was never in my mind, it just shows that if you work hard, you're developed by bosses that care deeply about you, that anything can happen. And that's what I think is so great about our military service.
That's an amazing story, and I think whether you're enlisted and you're coming in as a young guardian or a young airman, or you're getting that commission, it's so hard sometimes to see yourself as having that sort of potential, and yet nobody reaches the senior ranks that didn't start at that very same beginning point.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I look back as a young person and I critique myself. What would I have done differently? Although it all worked out pretty well for me, what would I have done differently as a young officer? And I think what I would have done differently was be a little bolder and just understand, as a young second lieutenant or a young first lieutenant or a young captain, you have significant amount of responsibilities. And I don't think I understood that as clearly. And I would have probably put the throttle up a little bit more as a young officer. And I probably didn't do that until probably when I was a colonel, when I really felt empowered. And really you're empowered at a very young age.
One of my favorite quotes, and we use this in our leader development workshops that we teach, is by a guy named Dr. Henry Cloud. And his quote goes something like this: "You are ridiculously in charge. In the end, as a leader, you have what you create and what you allow." And when I first read that, I was intrigued by why did he use that term, ridiculously in charge? And I think he was getting at exactly what you're saying. You have far more authority than you realize you do. What are you doing with it?
Right.
Because at the end of the day, you own what you've created or what you've allowed to come up under your leadership. Is that similar to what you're thinking?
I think so. And as then a future senior leader, as I look back, and I be in charge of organizations, and I would say, hey, if we can only go as far as I can task us, we're in deep trouble, because I just don't have the bandwidth, the intellect, the capacity to be able to task every flipping thing we need to do. I need all of levels of leadership rowing in the same direction and moving out, and that's really where organizations really pick up their pace and do great things.
So how did you, between the time that you got your commission and the time that you retired as a 4-star general, walk us through kind of the journey that you went through in terms of how you put that leadership philosophy together. I think there's probably a number of our listeners that aren't really familiar with the Air Force or the Space Force and don't even really understand kind of how does a guy get from being in that early time to those very senior ranks. Do you mind just kind of giving us a quick tour through the history of J. Raymond?
So, the history of J. Raymond, I started out as a missileer at Grand Forks Air Force Base in North Dakota. For me, it was a great place to start. It provided an operational foundation, checklist discipline, crew coordination, very high exacting standards that you didn't compromise on. And
Right.
so that's where I began. And then I moved out to Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. And, well, first of all, let me just say, I think J. Raymond or anybody is a sum of all the people that they've interacted with, and whether coworkers, peers, subordinates, and leaders. And got to Vandenberg Air Force Base and was really disenchanted. End of the Cold War. The Cold War had ended. The Air Force had been drawn down by half. I think we went from 600 and something thousand down to 300 and something thousand. I was in the ICBM business. The number of wings went from 6 to 3. I just didn't see a great future in there for me. And a gentleman came to town named General Sebastian Cogator, Seb Cogator. He was the first 30th Space Wing commander. And I made a good impression with him on a phone call. The day he came onto base, I worked in a command post. The very next day, he called me back, and I made another good impression. And then he shows up to work officially on that Monday and said he wanted to meet me and hired me to be his exec officer for the wing and got me into the space business about a year before the ICBM and space communities merged. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you, my love of that mission and the love of leadership that I got to see, he provided our wing, really set a fire in me, and off I went and never looked back. So I would say, that the operational foundation, then having an opportunity to get into the space business through General Cogator, getting to see his care of people was important. I then went to Air Force Space Command, which is the major command for space inside of the Air Force at the time. Had an opportunity to work for a guy named General Don Cook, who was the DO at the time, retired as a 4-star Air Education and Training Command commander. From him, I learned the value of putting the right people in the right job. He was masterful at working assignments and picking talent to go to the right place. And I learned from him just how important that was. At that same time, I was served as an exec officer to General Bob Kaler, who became the Stratcom commander. And I worked for General Kaler probably 8 times throughout my career. And he's probably the biggest strategic thinking officer I've ever had the privilege of serving with, and just learned a lot from him in multiple assignments. And then had an opportunity, later on to come back. And the other thing that General Kaler did for me, he put me in positions that were out of my comfort zone. So I deployed to the Middle East. Space operators can deploy, but it wasn't frequent. And so I had an opportunity to deploy as the Der Space 4 in 2006. He sent me to Japan, and I served as the 5th Air Force Vice, a position typically held by pilots. They were responsible for the F-15 wing at Kadena, the F-16 wing at Misawa, and then the C-130 wing at Yokota, and learned about the Pacific, got immersed into broader parts of the Air Force, and after that was selected to become the Air Force A3. I don't like talking about myself, and this is going to come out wrong, and I don't mean it this way, but I was the only non-pilot to ever serve as the Air Force A3. And the reason why that happened was I was given opportunities. Leaders gave me opportunities to get outside of my shell and my stovepipe career and see other things.
Can I just interrupt you real quick on that? And I hate to derail your train of thought, because what you've said is great so far. Oftentimes I've experienced this sense that there's one right way, there's one proper way to move through and to make the most of the opportunities that you have. And yet you've already talked about a number of different times that you were either told to go do something or took an opportunity to step outside what I think what would be considered the normal pathway. And yet it seems like what you're saying is every time you took one of those opportunities, another door opened that you were able to pursue that you would have never been able to do otherwise. Is that fair?
Oh, it's extremely fair. On all those stories that I just talked about, or the different places I went, from very early on after my ICBM career field, the job I went to at Vandenberg was a command post job. At the time, that was not on the critical path to greatness in the ICBM community. It proved to be the exact right thing for me because I ended up answering a phone call a couple days in a row with General Coglator, and look what happened after that.
Right.
There's so many different times throughout my career where somebody, I was at a place and somebody did something that if I hadn't been there, I wouldn't be here today.
Yeah.
And so this one specific path to greatness, if you will, there isn't such a thing. And my view is, and I never really even cared. I was not a big long-term career planner. I just, hey, where you want me to go, and I'll do the best job I can do at wherever you send me. I'm not saying that's the right way to do it. There's probably a little bit of planning that I probably should have had, but I was always just, hey, tell me what you want me to do, and I'll go do the best I can. If you do the best you can where you're planted, things tend to work out.
That's a great approach. And I think so often we lose sight of the fact that even how I answer this phone and the conversation I have may be something that's going to change my life for the better. And if we're more intentional about just taking advantage of those opportunities, who knows where our lives might have ended up.
Yeah, the other really clear example of this, I was at Air Force Space Command. After leaving Vandenberg, I went to Air Force Space Command, and there was a general named General Tim McMahon. He grew up to be a 2-star and retired. At the time, he was a colonel. And I had been selected to go to Air Command and Staff College at Maxwell. I had 2 little babies. We adopted and got pregnant at the same time, so they're 6 months apart. One brand new baby and then a 6-month-old. And I was planning to go down to Air Command and Staff College and just have a good time, get to know my family, if you will, and help raise our 2 daughters. And Colonel McMahon walked by and said, "Hey, Captain Raymond, when are you going off to school?" I said, "Or Major, when are you going off to school?" I said, "Sir, I'm leaving next week." And I'll never forget this. He said, "Get over here." And he put me up against the wall, grabbing onto my shirt collar, and said, "Don't go down there and screw off. Go down there and do good. You need to do good." And I remember going home telling Molly, my wife, "Hey, Colonel McMahon just said I got to go do good, and I got to study, and I got to try hard." So I did. And it worked well for me. If he hadn't have taken the opportunity to put me up against the wall, and I wouldn't recommend that as an approach, but metaphorically put me up against the wall, I wouldn't have done that. And then who knows what would have happened? I'm sure I wouldn't have had the opportunities coming out of school that I got based on doing good.
Yeah, I think there's never a penalty for doing well. Sometimes doing well leads to more work, but it also leads to more opportunities, leads to more adventures and open doors that you would have never had otherwise. And sometimes it's not actually the things that they're asking you to do aren't ridiculous. It's just, how do I make the most of the situation that's presented itself right now?
Yeah. But as a leader, how many times have you walked by somebody and not taken the minute to put them up against the wall and say, "Hey, go do this or do good," or whatever? And it just stuck with me that the impact a person can have on somebody's life. Don't underestimate the impact that you can have on somebody's life as a leader, or even as a mentor or a subordinate, if you just care and speak up.
That's powerful. The intentional impact of your words to someone else can absolutely change their lives. I want to go back because you've talked about a number of things here that I think are really valuable. That first Space Wing commander that you mentioned, can you tell me his name again?
Seb Coglator.
Coglator. What was it that you took? Tell me about his leadership, and what were some of the things that you took? You were sitting there working directly for him. What are some things that you saw that you felt like you internalized or tried to facilitate later on in your own life, in your own leadership?
I think, first of all, he was a space expert. He knew the launch business cold. He had grown up in the launch business, had been a significant leader in space launch for years. So he when he talked, people listened. He was a true expert. And so clearly, I think the thing I learned is, if you're going to do a job, you want to be recognized as the person that understands that the best. And so understanding your job, learning your job, and being an expert is critical. At the same time, he had an approach about him that was very open. He didn't put up walls, and people weren't scared to come talk to him. I have worked for other leaders that weren't that way. We all have our own styles. He was very approachable. People weren't scared to share their feelings with him, and just went out of his way. And I'd say probably more so than any other person that I've worked for in the military, went out of his way to be a really kind person. I'll tell you a funny story. He liked working on cars, and he was at the auto hobby shop working on a car, and there was an airman changing his axle next to him. And General Cogator went over to help the young man change his axle. And then Cogator went to pay to leave for the work he did. And as he was leaving, the young airman went up to the person behind the counter and said, "Hey, you got to..." At the time, you had stickers on our windshields to get onto base. And if you were a general officer, you had a star on top of that sticker.
Right.
And so this airman saw this star on the sticker and went up to behind the counter and said, "Hey, you got to tell that guy to take the star off of his car because he can get in trouble for impersonating a general." He just couldn't believe that somebody cared enough about him to help him change an axle, somebody at a senior leadership position on a base. And that's just, when I think of General Cogator, that's what I think of.
And did you then embrace that and try to carry that through your own leadership?
I did try to. I don't know, you'd have to talk to people that worked for me if I was successful at it, but I really tried to be approachable, be a humble leader, and really listen to other folks' ideas. You were very kind up front and talked about history making. I was part of a team that really made history, and I was really lucky to be part of that team that made history. And there are examples where I would have gone a different direction, and the team said, "No, we got to do this," and it was absolutely the right answer. So the whole team made history. I'm very proud of them. But being able to facilitate people not being afraid to come to you with ideas, I think, is important.
So I want to.
I'm sorry.
No.
Because as a leader, people are going to be there. When you're in a leadership role, nobody wants to bring you bad news.
Right.
You really have to fight for information. From all kinds, whether it's the barber and he tells you what's going on base or whatever. You really got to fight for information, and if you make it more difficult than it already is, you're really going to be hindering your ability to be an effective leader.
Yeah, so that's a great point, because when we're doing our leadership workshops, we are often asking airmen and guardians and other clients who are in the class to talk with us about what are some challenges that they're facing. And so often airmen and guardians in particular, their challenge isn't so much down the chain where they have real authority. It's up the chain where they're relying on influence and the ability to hopefully move someone in a different direction, and they're struggling with that. And what I heard you just say is that it's really incumbent on the leader to make that pathway known, because it's already uncomfortable and awkward for the subordinate to try to do it. Were there particular ways that you tried to make sure that people knew that you were serious? You weren't just, "Hey, does anybody have anything?" But it better agree with what I've already said.
Yeah, I don't know how successful I was. I'm sure there will be people that you will talk to that said, "No, he just said, here's how we're going to do business." But I tried not to. I'll give you an example, one that comes to mind. I was the wing commander at the 21st Space Wing in Colorado Springs. And we had just put together a new strategic plan for the wing with a new mission statement and the vision, and here's our goals and objectives. We went through that whole process and put this plan together. And then I had a commander's call at the base theater, and the entire wing, most of the wing that was there at Peterson that day showed up, 600 and something folks. And I walked through this. And at the end of the session, I'll never forget this. This young airman who worked in the Security Forces Squadron. And I know exactly where it said, sitting right in the front row down on the right. And he stood up and he said, "Sir, I hear you. I'm excited to be a knight of the 21st Space Wing. I've listened to you. I just don't see how I fit into that vision statement or into the strategic plan." And I said, "Well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to swing by and pick you up from work, and I'm going to bring you over to my office and let's talk about it. Let's sit down and talk about it. And if we have to make some adjustments, we'll make adjustments." And I did that. We went over, picked him up, took him to the office and spent about an hour with him, walking through his tie to that mission. I think one of the critical things a leader can do is make the tie for every single person in the organization to mission success.
Right.
And we were able to walk through that, and I think at the end of that hour, he understood it and he got it. But it sent another more powerful message, even than to that just one individual. It sent a message across the wing that, hey, you can stand up and ask questions and have a different point of view, or hey, this didn't resonate with me, sir, and not be afraid. And,
right.
and I think that was an example of where I tried to do that.
Yeah, I've worked for certain leaders that you couldn't pay me to have stood up, and I had significantly more rank than that young airman did. So you must have, I'm sure there's somebody out there, as you said, that, well, one time he told me what to do, but clearly, if your openness to receiving feedback made it all the way down to that young airman, that's a good sign.
Yeah, I hope so. And I think there were times afterwards then that I noticed that other people did the same thing. It's one of the things that I had a command chief named Chief Tim Amdahl, who was my command chief, and he was a spectacular airman. But when I was the wing commander, what I would do is I'd run things by him and say, hey, how will this resonate? How will people in the wing relate to what we're trying to say? And he was really masterful at helping. He'd say, yeah, I hear what you're trying to say, but that's not the way you say it, sir. Let's go this way. And it was really masterful at that.
So I think that's a great point, that even though you've never been enlisted, you've certainly been in a position where you've taken lots of advice from enlisted personnel. Any recommendations for that enlisted member who has an opportunity in terms of how they might be able to deliver an honest piece of feedback in a way that's going to be received, or is it up to each individual?
I think it's up to each individual, but I guess what I would say is don't be scared to give that feedback. I think you're empowered to give that feedback. We need to get that feedback. Your feedback could really make a difference for mission success or not. And what you'll see for all the young airmen and guardians and young officers in the wing or deltas, as we call them in the Space Force, you're the experts. I mean, we're paying you to be the experts. And so your voice really, really matters. I'll give you another story that on a way that feedback was given. I was at this, again, going back to the 21st Space Wing, I was at the wing and did a commander's call a year before the one that I just talked about. And at the time, this young airman who was living in the dorms on base stood up and said, sir, is there any way we can get ovens in the dormitories? I said, I don't know why we couldn't make that happen. So I turned to the support group commander. I said, hey, can we get ovens in the dormitories? He said yes. I said, okay, we'll take care of it. We'll get you ovens. And a year later, at the commander's call that I was just talking about, when we laid out the strategic plan, when I asked if there was any questions, this same young airman stood up and said, sir, last year I asked you if we could get ovens in the dormitory, and you told me you could, and we haven't gotten them. I said, oh, yes, we got them. In fact, I had gotten feedback that they had arrived on base shortly after that. And he said, no, sir, they're not in the dorm. I said, I know they're in the dorm. I'm arguing with them. No, they're there. I was told. And you could just see the support group commander slumping in the seat. And I had turned over and I said, hey, didn't we get ovens in the dorm? Well, sir, we're still trying to get them installed. So we didn't get ovens in the dorm. And I said, hey, we will make this a top priority. We will get these ovens installed. And he said, well, great, sir, but I was really hoping to cook Thanksgiving meal for my friends. And that's really what I wanted them for. And, that's coming up like in a week. And I told him, I said, I'll tell you what, I probably can't get the ovens in a week, but what I'll do is you can have the DV guest lodge at Peterson. I'll give you that facility and just invite your friends over, cook Thanksgiving dinner and enjoy it. And then, we'll get the ovens in as soon as you can. But that showed a couple things. The one, it showed that you can make a difference for issues just bigger than yourself. Now everybody in the dorm will be able to have the benefits of having ovens, for example. You can hold leadership accountable. One of the key principles of leadership that I have always touted is you got to set really high standards, and you have to hold yourself and those that you're privileged to lead accountable to meet those standards. He held me accountable in a way that was kind of very public. He also held the support group commander accountable. And in the end, the airmen were better off because of it. And so, again, don't be scared. If you have an idea, don't be bashful to bring it up. And if you do bring it up, make sure it gets followed through to completion.
What you just described, you and I have spoken briefly on just this leadership model that we use in our leader development workshops. And there's 3 primary responsibilities. There's leading, developing, and caring. What you just talked about is such a great example of the care responsibility, and in particular, the operational aspects that go into that are know, connect, provide, and protect. And I think through that provision of the ovens, airmen had communicated to you, this is something we need, this is something that would make our lives better, and that you have the power to provide to us. You chose to do that. And then by providing that, and then when it didn't happen when it was supposed to, but giving them an alternative that says, look, this is something that's important enough to me that I'm going to make this happen one way or the other. That's communicating to them this connection piece that I see you as a human being. You're not just a technician that's out there producing something or working a particular you're not a cog in this big machine. You're actually a human being with value, and I see that. And I think that's powerful. I think so often, if you were to ask, I've never asked a leader yet who said, no, I don't care for the people who work for me. It's a given. Yes, I care. How do you communicate the care that you feel to the care that the airmen or the guardians or your subordinates actually are able to internally feel that this is the boss caring for me? And that's a great example.
Thanks.
Yeah.
You have to care for your folks. The old adage, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. I really believe that. I think if you're responsible for conducting a mission, you have to care for the people that are doing it. You can't. It's mission failure without it.
Right.
It can't just be lip service. It has to be genuine.
So, in the aspect of care, since we're in this area now, one of the things that I see leaders often struggle with is this certainty that I need to be caring, and even I think in most cases a real desire to care, and yet it's an incomplete version of care because they are so care-centric that they forget that part of care is accountability. Part of care is setting standards and holding people to standards. Have you experienced in your journey the difference between caring without accountability and then the kind of caring that goes with, no, there are standards and discipline in order to ensure that we are functioning as efficiently as possible?
I have, and I will tell you growing up in the first ICBM business and then the space business, I didn't have a lot of leadership opportunities. I mean, I commanded a missile crew of one other person. The very next time I had an opportunity to command was as a squadron commander. 0 command leadership opportunities in between. I was on a staff, one operational job, staff jobs, and then squadron command.
Right.
And so I had a lot to learn. And I will tell you, as a young commander, I probably overachieved on the caring side because I wanted to be liked. I mean, that was important.
Sure.
And all leaders want to be liked. And I think that's not a bad thing to, everybody wants to be liked. But that shouldn't be the measure of success for leadership. It's about, in my opinion, being respected. And I really didn't learn that as well until I became a wing commander. And I had mentioned previously I had a wing command chief named Tim Amdahl. He was a security force airman, probably the best leader I've ever been around. And he taught me something that has stuck with me to this day. And he said, sir, there's a difference between leadership and likership. And that a lot of folks that struggle with leadership confuse it with likership, and they want to be liked. Again, you can't be universally hated because that's not an effective leader.
Right.
But it's not a popularity contest. There are going to be times in the military where you're going to send somebody into battle and they might lose their lives. It's not about being liked. It's about being respected and making the tough calls and kind of doing them consistently. There's many examples of where that creeps in to highlight. If you look at inflated OPRs or EPRs, the boss wanted to be liked, so gave a rating on an OPR that might not be 100% accurate. Inflated medals, the boss wanted to show, hey, I like you, and I'm going to put you in for, a Legion of Merit when you're really, at your rank and level of performance should have been at a combination medal. But I'll let my boss say no to you because I want to be liked by you, and I'll just show you how much I care. That's not a good thing for the service. It's not a good thing for the force. You're going to have to make some tough calls, and I think I got better at it as I went. I probably erred on the too nice side as a squadron commander, and learned the difference, fine-tuned the difference between leadership and likership as I had further command opportunities.
I see. My experience is that generally speaking, people thrive when they know that there's a right and a left boundary. They know what that boundary is, and they know that everybody will be treated similarly if they step outside that boundary. I think maybe initially people we agonize when there's boundaries. We want there to just be, I want to be able to do whatever I want. But that's not really true, because now it's anarchy at that point. People like to know these are the rules. If I step outside that rules, something's going to happen. And once people realize that you're serious and that's the way it is, then everybody begins to thrive because they know these are the rules of the game, and everybody's playing by the same set of rules.
Yeah, I can't agree more. And I think it's important for leaders, whatever level you're at, to set those high standards and hold people accountable. I think it's really important. I think the reason why people don't is they go back to what I just talked about, the difference between leadership and likership. They're afraid that if I set really high standards and if I hold people accountable, they're not going to like me. It's going to be really hard. And what I have found is the exact opposite, that when leaders set high standards, hold themselves accountable, hold everybody in that organization accountable to meet those standards, they thrive. And I go back to a time when I was an ops group commander at Vandenberg. I had a squadron commander that held really, really, really high standards. And it didn't matter if you were going up to the snack bar at his squadron, perfectly stocked, everything was perfect.
Right.
Or if you're launching a rocket, everything is perfect. And then I had, other leaders on base where that wasn't the case, and it was night and day. And I think setting those really high standards is critical. And it's not about being liked or being respected. It's about having an effective, efficient organization that does the mission well, no matter what it is.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Shifting gears just a little bit to more on the side of development and how young Jay Raymond was developed through. Any examples of times when somebody poured into Jay Raymond and intentionally developed you, or maybe how you did that with your subordinates?
Yeah, well, there's no way I would be where I am today without a lot of people pouring their development energy into me. It took a lot to get me from where I was as a second lieutenant to where I retired. I've given a couple examples of folks that reached down and cared about me and set me up to do things I otherwise would not have done, and putting me in positions to serve that wasn't part of the norm, pushing me beyond my comfort factor to get me out of my comfort factor to grow and learn. I think all of those things throughout my career paid huge dividends as I progressed.
And in order to do that, they had to be thinking about you personally. It had to be a very specific, what can I do? How can I move him forward? And it wasn't that you were doing something wrong. It was more about, I see potential. How do I move him so that he's developing the potential that I see? I think oftentimes as leaders, we get so busy that we just forget, if we've got a strong performer, we just take advantage of the strong performance, and we forget that what's my responsibility to that person to make them even better. And it sounds like you had those people who were looking at you that way.
I did, and at the time, I would be thinking, well, why am I doing this? Why am I going off here? Why am I doing that? And it really didn't. I've thought a lot about, after retiring, I've thought a lot about all the different building blocks that I was afforded the opportunity to have growing up in my career, and how they all came together when I served as the chief of a service. I had an opportunity to work in OSD in a transformation office when we started thinking through proliferated architecture in space. Well, if you look at what we did in the Space Force, we're now doing proliferated architecture. That all came back from when I was a colonel. There's many examples of that where I was stationed in Japan in a job that typically wasn't held by a space officer, and I learned about international partnerships. And when I was in Japan, there was an earthquake and tsunami and nuclear reactor disaster.
Right.
And I saw the value of having international partners. And I remember thinking to myself, we don't have that in space. And if I ever was in a position where I could be able to make that happen, I'm going to do that. If you look at what we did in the Space Force, we really tried to overachieve on maturing the small number of partnerships that we had in making them a more robust and growing those partnerships. So there's many times throughout your career that you'd say, now, why am I here? But I'll tell you, your bosses understand all the different pieces that need to happen. So if you ever had that opportunity to move into senior leadership positions or higher level leadership positions, you'll have those experiences necessary to do well.
Great examples. I think sometimes that most of our leadership energy when it comes to development is focused on the people who are struggling. There's an obvious capability gap that I need to help close, and so rightly so, my focus is there. But I sometimes forget that the people who are doing amazing things deserve my attention as well. And in my opinion, it's sometimes the biggest bang for the buck, the biggest return on investment is when I pour into those people like yourself who were striving and had potential that just needed to be developed. What can I do? And it requires taking a step back and being very intentional, thinking about each of the people that I'm responsible for and what do they need from me. And I think that one quality in stepping back and thinking about you as a human being and what do you need from me can make all the difference in the world.
Yeah, I think so. And I think one of the things that I struggle with early in my leadership opportunity as a squadron commander, which was my first leadership opportunity after missile crew, if you will, was that I had one instance in the time of my command where there was a significant an airman had a misstep that was pretty significant. And I spent way too much time and energy focusing on what's the right answer for handling that, because I hadn't done it before, and I wanted to be liked. You know, I didn't want to, and while I was doing that, which was extended for too long of a time, what I didn't do was pay attention to those that were knocking it out of the park. And I think you have to be careful that you handle those types of situations carefully, with consistency and compassion to those that have had a misstep. But at the same time, you don't let yourself get bogged down on it and not focus on the mission and leading those that are doing very, very well.
100% agree that we often say that when your care for one person impedes your ability to care for everybody else that you're responsible for, it's probably an indicator that you're going too far.
I agree.
Let's move to the stand-up of the Space Force. We're about halfway through, and I just want to make sure we have time because amazing lessons there that I think are applicable to leadership across the board. One of the things that strikes me as something that you really had to think hard about was as we spin off this new force from the Air Force and then we conglomerate from the rest of the services, is creating an identity, creating a Space Force identity. How deliberate did you have to be and your team have to be in terms of what that identity looks like?
I think it was very, very deliberate and very critical. I probably didn't have a great enough appreciation for just how important that separate identity was. General Goldfein was the Chief of Staff of the Air Force when we first established the Space Force, and he set a really good foundation of, hey, we're gonna be best friends. There'll be no daylight between the Air Force and Space Force. We're going to do this well, and you'll have our total support. And I thank him considerably for all that he did. But at some point, the Air Force could have hugged us too closely.
Right.
And then we couldn't flap our wings and be an independent service. So, I tell them, hey, thank you, but sometimes we're gonna have to pick a fight, and you're gonna have to let me win one or two of these, so we can kind of establish an identity that we're a separate service. But things like, and all the identity things that we really addressed early on were all those things that cause flare-ups on Twitter and all that. But things like, what do you call a person in the Space Force? For the longest time, we just called ourselves space professionals because we didn't have a term. We have airmen, we got sailors, we got soldiers, we got Marines. What are we? I mean, we crowdsourced that. We had like 700 different names. We had linguists coming up with different words. I mean, we looked at every possible option, and we finally picked one. And when we picked one, Guardians, which I think was perfectly fitted for the mission that we do, and it had a tie to our past because at Air Force Space Command, which the large part of our force came from, we were always called the Guardians of the High Frontier.
I remember it.
We had a magazine every month, the Guardians of the High Frontier magazine. Well, as soon as that came out, we were ridiculed that we stole it from Guardians of the Galaxy.
Right.
When we did our logo, so when we first stood up, I needed a uniform and I needed a logo so we could build a flag and start building identity. And I went to the White House, and I'm sitting in front of the president's desk with the president, the vice president, the secretary of the Air Force, and a few others. And I said, sir, you kicked me out of the Air Force. I need a uniform. And so I said, day to day in the Air Force, we wear OCPs, our utility uniform, and it has brown thread for a name tape. The Army wears the exact same uniforms. It has black thread. And, on the Space Force, I think we just need to change the color of thread and wear the same uniform. And so I had a shirt made up that had Raymond and Air Force in brown thread. I had Raymond and Air Force in black thread. I had Raymond and Air Force in blue, and then one in silver. And I said, well, what color do you think? And he said, I like blue. And I said, I like blue. And so that's how that uniform became. But it was important that we had something that just wasn't in the Air Force.
Right.
The symbol that we picked took a lot of the design elements that were in the Air Force Space Command design element, and we made the seal. Had 4 different choices for the seal. In that same meeting, 2 decisions out of that, the uniform and the seal. I handed a white corkboard to the president and said, sir, here's 4 choices. He picked the choice that we implemented. And when that was tweeted out, everybody said we stole it from Star Trek. Well, if you go look back at Air Force Space Command, it's all the globe and the orbit and the delta were all part of that. And so it was really important. It resonated very, very well inside of the force. We took a little bit of heat on the outside of the force, those that didn't understand the legacy or the history of what we had. But I think it was really, really important to set that culture. If you look at everybody used to ask me all the time, when are you going to get your culture done? And I said, it's not like it's something that you can order on Amazon Prime and it'll be here overnight.
Right.
It's going to take some time. We're bringing people in from the Air Force and from the Navy and from the Army and the Marine Corps, bringing people in from off the street through Air Force Academy or ROTC or basic training. It's going to take some time to get the team, and we'll see how this evolves. And there's some of that is probably true, but others I think we probably should have done a little bit more early on to engineer the culture that we want. Because what I found is, if you don't, and you just kind of leave it open, then things start popping up that you don't want.
Right.
And so, kind of later on in my tenure as the CSO, we did some effort to try to say, okay, here we know we want these tenets as part of our culture. What can we do to kind of engineer ourselves down that path to get there faster, and to keep us focused on what we want rather than the weeds that'll grow if left untended. So, but all of those things were really, really important. And although they were somewhat painful as we were going through the process, they've proven to be very, very valuable to the service.
I think there's probably so many similarities when the Air Force became a separate service. I'm sure that they just received unending feedback from the Army, and every decision they made was probably questioned or mocked or whatever. And yet, within the service, it needed to feel, no, we are separate, we are distinct, and it gives people a connection to who am I and what am I doing. And as important as I think as it is when you're standing up a brand new service, I think these same things that you just talked about are important even on a much lower scale. Even that first line supervisor that has 3 airmen that they're responsible for, how do I create an identity amongst this small little team that people can buy into? And I think my sense is that certainly throughout my time in the Air Force, that was an area that I didn't spend enough time thinking about. Within the bigger identity of the Air Force, how do I create a smaller identity for my team that we can get behind, and it's a cohesion factor or a glue that brings us together. You're doing this now on a service-wide basis. Probably didn't get a lot of opportunities to work on how you do that well. You just found yourself in the midst of it.
Yeah, Pat, what you said just resonated with me. If we hadn't had the privilege of serving together, if I hadn't known you before, and I showed up here today for this podcast, and if we had sat outside for 5 minutes and you told me, hey, I was in the Air Force for X number of years, I was a security force member, I commanded, squadron and group level, I would know you. Mm. Even though I don't know you, I know you. I know who you are. I know your cultures. I know your values. I know how you grew up. I know how you're trained. I know you without ever having known you. And so that's what we were trying to build inside the Space Force. I think the other big thing that we did was this wasn't all just top down. And in fact, if you look at the things that were the most successful, it was the things that were done from the bottom up. If you look at the enlisted rank structure and the enlisted, the insignia, that was all done by our enlisted guardians. Mm. And I'll tell you, we went through all kinds of challenges with all the other things that I mentioned. Not a single challenge with that. It grew from the bottom. They thought through it. It was really well done. And today it's been very, very successful. If you look at core values, this is an area, again, taking feedback from others. When folks came to me and said, hey, we need our own set of core values, I said, hey, we got core values. We're part of the Department of the Air Force. I was in the Air Force before we had our 3 core values. I saw the goodness that occurred when we got those core values. I'm happy. That's not something we need to focus on right now. There's a million other things we need to focus on. They said, sir, you don't understand. And they went and put a team together and built for months, went through from the ground up, what should the core values of this team be? And they came to me, and over a period of a couple months, we iterated on this, and we came up with core values. Took it to the new Secretary of the Air Force, thinking this is going to be a hard sell, and he said, "Of course you need core values. You're a new organization, separate organization." So we implemented those core values. What I didn't realize, the core values really serve as the foundation of your culture. And as we were building this culture and building this organization, it was important that we had our own core values. And I think, left on my own, I would not have focused on that when we did. I'm glad people spoke up because it was important to our service.
I love the way that throughout this process, I think oftentimes people look at you and they just make assumptions that you were the one driving every single aspect of the stand-up. And yet what I hear you saying repeatedly is that, look, I had thoughts about some of the major direction we were going, but lots of the details were engineered from the bottom. A plan was put together as it worked its way through, and you were certainly involved in the implementation of those things, but you allowed for a lot of bottom-up processing in order to get the service to where it needed to be.
Yeah, I think it's important to do so, because if you don't, people aren't going to have buy-in on it. And I think it's important that folks in the organization have ownership and say, hey, I was part of that. I think as a leader, what we tried to do was put left or right limits, kind of some bumpers. If you were to go ask, hey, what do you want our uniforms to be? You might get answers that you're not going to be able to say yes to, if you will, or what should our dress and appearance standards be?
Right.
So you had to have some bumpers, if you will, but inside of those bumpers, I wanted buy-in. I wanted to know what the force wanted. Every single person that came into the Space Force, whether you were an Air Force member, Army, Navy, Marine, or from the academies or from ROTC or coming in through basic training, every single person had to volunteer. Not one person was ordered to move from one service to another. They all chose to do so. And what we wanted to do was live up to those expectations. As a space operator in the Air Force, it was pretty easy to volunteer. My job's going that way. If I don't go, my job's gone. But for acquisition professionals, they could have chosen to stay in the Air Force or come to the Space Force. For the intelligence professionals, for the engineers, for cyber professionals, they all had choices, and they had to choose. And so that was a little harder decision, because they were all doing well in the service. If you were from another service, you probably even had a harder decision. You had, command sergeant majors and Navy captains that volunteered to come over. Think about, having served in that service, those respective services for 20-something years, and now all of a sudden saying, hey, I'm going to take a chance. They wanted to be part of something new, wanted to create something new. We wanted to live up to those expectations. What I didn't want to have happen is have somebody volunteer to come in and then 2 years later say, man, I made the wrong choice. This was not good, and regret it. And so we worked really hard not to have folks regret that significant decision that they made to come our way.
The other thing I've noticed as you worked through that is there was a great deal of intentionality in terms of this is an opportunity that most services don't get. All the other services have inherited a way of doing business that's very difficult to change after the fact. But it seems like from the outside, the Space Force was working very hard to think outside the box. Like, we have an opportunity to engineer something from the ground up. Let's really think, open ourselves up to not being constrained to just the way we've done it before, regardless of the background. That's admirable, but it's also challenging, because when you really open it up, now anything's almost possible. How did you sort of keep that together?
I think anything's possible if you open it up, but also if you open it up too far, you run into bureaucracy. And so I laid out to the team early on, I said, hey, I think we have two risks. I think the first risk is that we don't think bold enough. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
Right.
We don't want to just nibble on the edges. We want to go big. And, I told everybody, you all have been in those seats before where you say, or in jobs before you say, man, if I was ever king or queen for the day, boy, I would do this.
Right.
Now is your chance. Now is the time. The challenge is when you do that and you are bold, the bureaucracy might squash it and say, no, that's not the way we do business. And I think, people ask me, it had to be really challenging to stand up a new service. It was probably harder because we were doing it inside of the big bureaucracy of the Department of Defense. If we were just kind of off on our side doing it, it'd be pretty easy. We'll figure this out and give us a couple months. We'll be back to you. It takes working through a bureaucracy takes a little bit more energy and purpose and drive, if you will. And you got to realize that all your ideas might not be accepted, but some of them will. And I think if you look at some of the things the Space Force has done, for example, the new way we're doing total force integration. That was an idea that started kind of day one when the law was passed, and they told us to figure out a new way to integrate the total force, because our service only has 8,000 active duty people at the time.
Right.
And so we came up with an idea. It took several years to get buy-in from that through Congress. We had to write like a 186-page legislative proposal for it, but it happened. And it's a big change, and it's going to deliver huge advantage to that service. So we did some things that are tactical that were really easy to do on our own, and we did some things that were really huge game changers that inside of the department they needed to make sure worked, and took a little bit more time.
And I love the fact that in being bold, you weren't fearful in the sense of, hey, let's do this. This seems like it makes sense. We've put a lot of thought, energy into it. This seems like a right way to go. And yet, over time, since the stand-up to now, there have been, maybe we need to tweak this a little bit. We need to change this. And that's all part of that formation of culture, formation of processes that really get you to the ideal. And there's no shame in that. There's no shame in let's start with this. Let's see if it works. It's very different. And then being willing to come back and adjust down or change, maybe pivot a little bit. There's no issues with that.
I think so. I had an opportunity to listen to Jeff Bezos speak about leadership once. I invited him to come to a commander's conference that I had at Air Force Space Command. And he came in and he spoke. And I remember something that stuck with me. He talked about one-way decisions and two-way decisions. One-way decisions are you go out the door and there's no coming back. Two-way decisions are you go out the door and if it doesn't work, you come back and try it again. So, there are some things that we knew were going to be really, really, really critical that were kind of one-way decisions that if we went out and it didn't work, it's going to be really hard to take that back. So some things took a little bit more time. There's other things that we knew if it didn't work, we'll try something else.
How do you differentiate between those? Like, I'm just thinking that's a really interesting idea that could be applied kind of at any level of leadership. How do you work through which one's a one-way decision, which one's a two-way decision?
Yeah, I think it. So again, this was not my idea. I learned this from Mr. Bezos, and I don't know how he would define this. But as I looked at it as kind of core to our mission success, and that's something that if we went down that path, it took so much energy, and it was so tied to our mission that we couldn't make a shift back. And I don't know exactly how he would describe it, but as I looked through all the different decisions that we needed to make, if the I'm making this up, the color of the whatever on a uniform didn't work out well change the color. But if it was no kidding, here's how we integrate into joint warfighting and socialize that and work that with all the other services, and all of a sudden you say, oops, didn't work, that wasn't going to play.
Yeah. I think as I think about different challenges that I had at different levels of leadership, sometimes I felt like if I make a decision, my identity is on the line if I have to come back and change that. And yet inevitably there were things that I had to come back and change, or I had to admit to the team, hey, this was my call. I made it. It wasn't the right answer. I'm sorry. Let's help me fix it. Almost inevitably, the times when I was willing to come back and say, hey, we tried it. It didn't work. My fault. Help me fix it. I feel like my team actually rallied behind me more than if we had just driven forward. I think people want to see the vulnerability of the leader. They know we're human, and the quicker we embrace the fact that we're human and they know I'm human, the quicker we kind of get over that, what can be a real constraint in our leadership.
Yeah, I think, and it also shows taking ownership. You took ownership of it. What has always something that I've always disliked is when. So let's say I'm again making up a fictitious thing, but let's say as a squadron commander, our squadron wanted to do something, and I packaged it up, took it to the wing commander, and said, "Hey, here's what we want to do," and he or she said no. Well, then going back to the squadron saying, I really want to do that, but my boss said no. In this case, and I don't think that's right. I don't think it's right to throw your bosses under the bus. You don't know the context that that person is in. So I always think it's important to take ownership of it. But my view was, if it's not going to kill us, why not try it?
Right.
I mean, and again, there are some things that were out there that were a little too bold. Let's just say that we didn't try, but there's other things that we absolutely did. And for the most part, what I found was those things that the force brought to the fore and said, this is what we want to do, they went really, really well. And they're the things that you look back on and say, man, that's been really good.
Right.
So I'll tell you, I talked about the name and the uniform and the song and the patch. There's a couple other things that stand out on that. And it's getting other people's points of view. I had an exec officer who was an Army colonel. I did that purposefully because I wanted to show that other services, were important.
Right.
So, hey, look, this person. And so we had developed a new patch for the Space Force, and it had the elements of the SEAL that were in that patch. And I showed it to him. Say, hey, what do you think? It's a great patch, but it looks like an Air Force patch. That's what I mean. It looks like it's the same, shape of an Air Force patch. Why would you do that? You're a different service. And I thought about it. I said, he's right. And so we went back, and now if you look at the patch, it's a delta.
Right.
Well, that became because of the conversation that somebody had a different point of view that wasn't afraid to speak up and say,
Right.
hey, it's really good, but it's an Air Force patch, and we're not in the Air Force anymore. And so that was one. And then the other one that was really good was I got an email one day from an airman in Europe, and he said, his name was Daniel, and he said, I've come up with a new motto for the Space Force called Semper Supra. And in this email, he walked through, here's the Army motto, here's the Air Force motto, here's the Navy motto, here's the Marine Corps motto, here's the Coast Guard motto, and Semper Supra means always above. And I said, man, I love it. It's great. So, it's probably above my pay grade to say yes to it, but I'm going to make sure we can get to a yes to it. And was over at the White House a few weeks later and had an opportunity to talk to leadership over there about our new motto. And, man, it sounds great. And so, boom, like that, it was done. And nobody's ever once complained about that motto. And it was one airman speaking up, and again, we had hundreds and hundreds of people crowdsourcing names and all this, but this one airman that spoke up he was a public affairs airman at Ramstein. And out of the blue sent this thing in.
And not even Space Force.
He's in the Space Force now. He transferred over.
That's great.
He's a space operator, I think.
And if I'm not mistaken, didn't the Space Force song originate with the Guardian as well?
With an airman. The Space Force, there's an airman named Jamie Teachner who was in the Air Force band. Mm-hmm. He was a Nashville singer-songwriter, very successful. After 9/11, he decided, hey, I want to serve. Came into the band, was stationed at Peterson Air Force Base, so he had a band, Air Force band there on base, and so he did a lot of support for Air Force Space Command at the time. He sent me a note saying, hey, I've written a song, and we worked for over a year on this song, tweaking the words, and the bands got involved and with the music pieces of it, and we unveiled it at the AFA symposium this September before I retired in November.
I remember that.
It was written by an airman who had supported Air Force Space Command for years.
It's such a great example of if you're trying to build a culture, if you're trying to build a culture, you should open it up as widely as possible to the culture and receive inputs, because that then generates the buy-in. And I think that those are really amazing stories about how leaders can look outside themselves, maybe even look to cultures different than their own. I often find when we're teaching these workshops that some of the most powerful things that come out of them is what they learn from one another. And we get them in small groups, and sometimes you'll have a security forces member, FSS member, maybe a med group member, and a ammo troop all sitting at the same table. And they're approaching these challenges or case studies from their own perspective, their own culture, and they're realizing, like, I never thought about handling it that way, and yet that might be exactly what I need to do. And so the more open you are to receiving inputs from people unlike yourself or who grew up differently than you really can oftentimes come up with a much better solution.
Yeah, I saw that when I was at Naval War College. In Naval War College, there's 14 of us in a seminar. And in the seminar, 13 of us were military and one civilian. Mm-hmm. That civilian was from the State Department. All 13 of us, we're in different services, all services represented, but we all kind of grew up the same way.
Right.
We all have similar culture, although different.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all the services are a little unique, but we all developed kind of the same way, same type of personalities. And when we would think through a problem, we came up with an answer like that. And then the gentleman from State Department said, let me give you a different point of view. Mm. And for those that are listening to this, you're too young to remember this, but there was a commercial years ago when E.F. Hutton, when E.F. Hutton talked, people listened.
People listen.
Well, this guy was E.F. Hutton, because when he talked, we all shut up, we listened, and then what we ended up doing was tweaking what we had come up with, and we actually came up with better plans because we listened to somebody else's point of view. And I thought that was very powerful learning for me is at that time in my career.
Yeah. Would have been very easy just to overwhelm the non-military person.
Andrew, go back to back
Right.
to State Farm. We got this here. Nothing to see here. But he made us better.
That's great. Well, General Raymond, I've taken up a good hour of your time, and I'm so grateful that you spent it with us. I think I could have talked for another hour easily. I really appreciate you being here and for all that you did, both for me when we worked together, and for Airmen and Guardians out there. Thanks for everything. Thanks for what you continue to do. I know you're a very busy person. At some point, maybe you'll actually get to retire.
I hope so.
Until next time, sir.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. It's great to be with you. As I said up front, I can't think of a better person to lead a leadership focus area than you, and I was really happy to have an opportunity to sit down with you and share a few thoughts.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Building Better Leaders. If you'd like to learn more about the Doolittle Leadership Center or the leader development workshops we deliver all around the world, please visit us at www.afa.org/DLC. Helping you become a better leader is our passion and our purpose.